Hi all, I have another amazing game to show you for our notable game today from the Engine world, and many thanks by the way to chessdom.com for sponsoring the TCEC competition, which is actually top chess engine competition, or sometimes I thought it was called the Forensen chess engine competition, but apparently not. It might be the top chess engine competition. So this was from season 8, stage 3, and a very strong engine by the name of Protector was playing white against Komodo. Protector's rating over 3,000, 3,003 in fact, and Komodo 3,222. So astronomical ratings. Let's see what happened. E4, E5, and we get knight f3, and you'd think of a rather dull opening called the petroff defense was played. Knight f6, very solid though, not creating too many weaknesses. Knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, knight takes e4, and we have a symmetrical structure, shared open file, d3, knight f6, d4, bishop e7. Very solid indeed. I'm pretty sure Magnus Carlsen has played this with black against Vishy Anand at some point and drew. Bishop d3. Black now castled. White castles. And here we have a pin. Bit of excitement. Bishop g4 pinning the knight. White plays h3. And the bishop drops back. In playing h3, the dark squares are subtly weakened, actually. You can imagine a piece coming to f4 later in theory, and it'll be more difficult to kick it sometimes. So the pin has caused a little bit of dark square weaknesses, but you could argue, well, this is useful for the endgame for the king to have some air, some luft. So rook e1. So nothing exciting so far. d5. Bishop e3. Rook e8. c3, and again nothing too exciting. Bishop d6, knight bd2, c6, so symmetrical on this side of the board as well. And you might think, has Kingscrusher gone mad? Why is he showing this game in the petroff? Surely nothing exciting can come from this position. Well, let's wait and see. Have a little bit of patience. The pawn structure now changes actually, so we get a very important structural change. Pawn to the soul of chess. c4. White is accepting an isolated queen's pawn. Like White's going for a win here with this structural change. So that's one question. Do engines have extra caution when changing the pawn structure in their algorithms? The pawn structure definitely changing. Is it for the better? D takes c4, so we have an isolated queen's pawn. A very long-term change in structure. Knight takes c4. What's the idea here? Bishop b4 gaining a tempo, hitting the rook. Now black doesn't want to exchange dark square bishops here. The rook just moves to f1. And it seems a little bit on the strange side that this rook, although it's a shared file, it's like White is not too bothered about explicitly contesting that shared file. Queen c7, and in fact here now it seems black is going to build up on the e file. We have knight d5 protecting the bishop here and putting pressure on e3. a3, bishop drops back, and White is not too concerned clearly about knight takes e3 here. More concerned about the structural damage that would result from bishop takes f3. Bishop g6, softening up White a bit on the light squares. If this bishop can be exchanged, then often it's the case that the light squares are slightly more vulnerable, like e4 and c4. White takes, doubling the pawns. Maybe you're thinking, structurally, this is good news. These double pawns, surely they're not very good here. But White does have the isolated queen's pawn. The structure is much more interesting than before in many respects. bishop d2, knight d7, queen b3. Now the blockade on d5 is reinforced. Knight c e5. And it seems black is in a comfortable position here to put a lot of pressure on the e5 square. Plays actually bishop d6 with the idea that black can actually quickly double rooks in this position. We see rook fe1, rook e7, a4, and yeah, black's left the double rooks here against e5. A lot of pressure is being built now on e5. It doesn't seem so boring, the structure, but it's more interesting visually. It seems for black here, all black's pieces seem well coordinated, and a lovely blockade on the isolated queen's pawn. Rook ac1, knight d7, asking white to do something with this e5 knight. We see knight c4. But the thing is the excitement premature? Surely all this means is that the rooks are going to rapidly come off the board in this position, leaving nothing much for either side. So bishop f4, bishop a5, kicking the queen. Black doesn't want to play b6, leaving c6 slightly vulnerable. Instead, queen c8, and now a couple of rooks come off. And now another couple of rooks come off. Now, actually, black does play b6, not fearing any weakness on c6. There's no rooks to torture the c6 pawn here. Queen d3, knight f8, knight e3, threatening to make the pawn structure symmetrical again. Queen d7, keeping this pawn isolated with a blockading point on d5. Knight takes d5, queen takes d5. So, are the double pawns here more significant as a weakness than the isolated queen's pawn? Well, here, actually, white goes after the a7 pawn with queen a6. And that pawn is protected, not only protecting the pawn, but also against queen c8 and queen b7. And a remarkable decision from a human perspective is played here. And this is the difference, I believe, between humans playing on principles and engines relying on a brute force incremental depth search. White plays something which maybe a lot of humans would not do in this position. White could play g3 and put the queen back on c4, and hopefully the isolated queen's pawn is not a losing weakness and it should be a draw soon. But what white did instead was play a move a5, and after b5 it appears to be the case that the queen is actually shut in, and it's only tactically that the queen could be broken out of this prison, this self-imposed prison, with something like d5 and knight d4 at the right time. As humans, we would, in general, with principles, try and avoid trap pieces and tactical liabilities in the long term. But from a calculating point of view, this, in a way, under better circumstances, could actually paralyse the black position if d5 at some point was going to be destructive for winning, say, b5 or winning a7. But in this case, yes, it seems as though the protector engine is relying a lot on calculation and not on principles. But that's what calculation machines do. They rely on calculation. How can you give an engine this principle? Don't have your queen trapped permanently. So here, white plays g3, and the trap is kind of secured in. Bishop b8 protecting a7. There's a possibility of playing d5 to try and wrench the queen out here, but it doesn't work too well in this particular position. White played actually bishop d2. If d5, trying to wrench the queen out, say queen takes d5, queen c8, so counter-attacking on the bishop here, but black can insert bishop takes g3, and then have a nice position, a nice advantageous position here, still protecting c6. So that doesn't quite work. And also here in this position, if queen b7, queen takes f3, queen takes queen d1. Actually, this is may have been, according to my engine analysis, one of the last chances to actually get out of this queen trap. This might be an improvement here. So to actually play d5 here it seems it might be possible with the idea of queen b7, not queen c8. So takes queen d1, king f1. Okay, so anyway, we have bishop d2, f6, which is a very, very interesting move. It already creates a new resource in the position. It not just deprives the e5 square, it creates the resource of g5. And you might think, what's the point of g5? Is that just to double black's pawns? Why would black be interested in g5? We have bishop e3. And now, knight e6, putting some pressure on d4. And here, if we look at this wrenching out of the queen business, white played b3, but if we look at d5 here, c takes, knight d4, let's put pressure on b5, black can take and play g5 with a nice position. And the queen's still hammed in here, locked in. So, okay, we have white playing b3. But what can black do to improve the position? Because in a way, black's kind of paralysed, trying to keep the queen trapped in. The queen can't really move, can it? If the queen moves anywhere, then like b7, for example, with d6, or c8, check. Okay, but we have king h7. Something is afoot here. King g2. And you might think, well, typical engines, they're just going to keep moving the kings and agree a draw here. But actually, something remarkable happens now in this game, which makes the game very, very special and interesting to study. Komodo plays g5. You might think, g5? Is that with the idea of g4? Well, here, king f1 is played. And now the point is starting to be revealed. Black, guess what black plays in this position? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. Okay. Black plays king g6. And now that g5 has made way actually for the king to head maybe on this diagonal. I know it's outrageous, but we do have some weak and light squares around here with that g3. That square is a bit weak. The game continued h4. And black just continued with king f5. There's a classic game in chess where British Grandmaster Nigel Short had a king walk in one of his classic games against Jan Timman. It was an immortal game. His king went to h6, he was playing white, and he kind of mated Timman. Timman was very restricted position, and here it seems white similarly is not doing anything, can't really do anything. White plays h takes g. Now this is a point where if black played f takes g5, it would seem the strongest might be d5, trying to wrench the queen out, and it would seem here queen takes, knight takes, check is sufficient for white to escape with a draw in this variation. But black just treats it as a pawn sacrifice, a positional pawn sacrifice, just to activate the king even further, immediately hitting f3 with the king. We have knight d2 check, and the king carries on its journey to d3 now. Knight f3. King c3, and it looks from a human perspective as though the threat is actually king takes b3. G takes f6 is played, and black reacts with g takes f6. And now letting b3 go, it seems, with king g1. The problem is here, actually, king takes b3 is not working too well. If king takes b3, white does have that d5 again, and after c takes, can play, guess what, in this position? If I give you 5 seconds to play a move with white, what would you play here? Okay, white can play queen takes e6 here, getting a fork possibility, which would usefully be good for white. So here, actually, black doesn't want the b3 pawn. It plays actually king d3. And is the king going to carry on its invasion to e2 to that f3 square knight, that f3 knight? If the king ever goes to g2, then we have queen d5, and the king and queen could coordinate on f3. We have king f1, refusing to go to g2 for a moment, because that pin looks pretty nasty. King c2 now, and it seems a case of like zugzwang here. It seems as though black is actually waiting for king g2. It's not about taking here. It's waiting for king g2. King g1 is played. And now we have king c3, like triangulation almost. King h2. Black is trying to wait as well without any king g2. King d3. And this has become very difficult. It seems this particular position with white to move is not very nice. It's like white is in a horrible kind of zugzwang here. If white didn't play this, if white plays king g1, avoiding at least this diagonal, then king e2, that infiltration, is leading to disaster. Anyway, this position, disastrous pin on f3. So white plays king g2 straight off the bat. Queen d5, which does let slip the c8 square. White tries to use that. Queen c8, still looking at e6 and c6. Here, king e2, as well as going to take the bishop. Now, just rewind there for a moment. Queen d5 was a very, very accurate move. If king e2, then actually white has check and king f1. So that pin on f3 is not happening. And if in this position of queen b7. So yeah, black is playing very accurately to try and exploit this pin on f3. Queen c8, king e2, offering the bishop on b8. Queen takes f3 check. And now this is really dangerous. This king is really an attacking piece, helping the mating net, helping cover the exit routes of the white king. Knight h3 check, and king f1 is threatened here. As an example, an outrageous example, say takes as an example just to show it, check. This position, king f1, is mating on g2. That would be a bit analogous to Nigel Short's king walk, immortal game. The king is really walking to set up a mating net with the queen on a weakened fianchetto position. So here, white plays queen h8. And now, after queen h8, queen f5. And there's a threat of knight f3 check, followed by f5. Mating. Just to show that as an example, an outrageous example, say a6. Check first. Knight f3 check. And now cutting off the exit square, f5. We'll be mating with queen f1 pretty soon. Or queen h1. The knight is covering that exit square. So the mating net is created here fully. So anyway, after queen f5, white just took on g5, and the battle's really lost here. Black doesn't routinely capture the bishop here. Black takes on f2 with the queen. F takes g5, and it's disastrous. Yes, this is a disastrous ending. The king is so active. Queen h7. Queen takes d4. Queen g6. That pawn is protected. b4. White's just losing all his pawns in this ending. After king e3. Queen f6. Check. King h2, and here it was adjudicated as a loss for white. A loss is pretty inevitable with very accurate play from here on in. Black is 2 pawns up with a really aggressive king already in the endgame. So at move 64, king h2, white with that move resigned. So a remarkable game. It shows perhaps as humans we rely on principles, and a lot of the time the brute force calculations of engines make them more flexible. That's the upside. They can calculate all the exceptions to the rules, but sometimes the rules have their place, that you don't do something out of principle. And that idea that we do things out of principle, it transcends an incremental depth search. In general, even good club players would generally not like the idea of their queen being trapped without an easy way of breaking the queen out. It seems black first tightened that net around the queen, and black, with a positional pawn sacrifice later, made the king extremely aggressive and started exposing white's light square weaknesses, particularly the f3 square. And the damage was starting to be done after that. A fantastic game, a very, very interesting game, showing a lot of things basically about human chess and computer chess and limitations of this incremental depth search. Some absurd possibilities that you wouldn't do as humans, but engines will indulge in that. But sometimes there is a downside which another engine especially is going to sometimes exploit, and here the aggressive king coming out to cause damage. Hope you enjoyed that one. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.